what's your type of self-confidence or self-esteem? Type A or type B? Hello and welcome to Communication Psychology. My name is Gerhard. I'm a psychologist from Hamburg, Germany, specialized in communication psychology in international, intercultural, and multilingual contexts. Thinking of communication training, most people immediately think about self-confidence. Especially in Germany, I'm quite convinced, although I'm from the north of Germany. Most people, after a presentation, when asked to give feedback, immediately give feedback according to how nervous or self-confident the person came across. It seems to me that that's the biggest concern for most Germans being on the stage. Am I looking nervous? Am I looking insecure? Am I showing some kind of vulnerabilities? Now, there actually are two types of self-confidence. Type 1, or sometimes called fragile self-esteem or self-confidence, is when your main focus is control. You want to control your audience and yourself. So you want to appear professionally, impeccably, in total control of the situation. So you have always the perfect answer, you show no doubts, you make no pauses, you make no mistakes, of course. So you are perfectly polished and in control of the situation. This is the dream of most people attending communication training. Now, what's the problem with this? It's lacking a bit on the human side. That is, there are studies, to many this may seem paradoxical, that in the perception of others, you will come across much more confident if you actually show some vulnerabilities, if you admit making mistakes. There are studies showing that so-called leadership humility increases how confident and trustworthy you are perceived by employees. And teams with humble or leaders with high humility, that is, leaders openly admitting of mistakes and showing some kind of human vulnerabilities, those teams show a higher level of psychological safety. That is, employees reciprocate. They also become more open and admit on faults and doubts and are open to share feedback, even if it's inconvenient at times. This means that actually you would come across as much more self-confident if you kept a bit of your humanity, if sometimes on stage you came across not as polished as you would like to come across. Now, this is probably no surprise. We want to have interactions with real humans, and the more rehearsed, the more polished you come across, the less the perceived level of authenticity in learning and becoming acquainted with new people. The first main concern is, can I trust this person? And a person that makes mistakes, admits mistakes, comes across a bit unpolished, unfiltered at times, well, on the one hand may lack a bit of professionalism, but on the other hand, at least you can be sure that that's a real person. And if you analyze a bit political movements during the last decade, you will see that sometimes people win, even if they commit many debate mistakes or in general are criticized for being a bit unhinged. You may say, well, I don't like everything this person says, but at least he is not a politician. He is a real human being trying to change something. This is the rationale for many voters of such typically populist politicians. So that's a bit of a paradox. We are afraid of coming across a bit unpolished, showing our own doubts, fearing others will not trust us for not being professional enough. But the reality is exactly the opposite. So the more we train of becoming more robotic and rehearse, the less the positive outcome we expect will be. So real self-confidence or authentic self-confidence or self-esteem would be a self-esteem where you admit your human sides. You're not afraid of publicly admitting mistakes, which actually is also a show of strength. So if you don't care of having made a mistake, if you can say sorry in front of your company, we often misstep, and fragile human beings, they often cannot do this. They cannot say sorry. So it takes much more self-confidence to admit your mistakes and ask for forgiveness. And if you have that type of self-confidence, then you don't depend on constant validation as in the first type. If you're always striving for perfection and polish, then you always need positive feedback that you are so great, you are so self-confident. You need positive feedback on your self-confidence. Somebody who is really self-confident really doesn't need this validation all the time. Now, the question is, how could you develop those types of self-confidence? Well, if your communication training consists mostly of learning some postures, of learning how to posture in a conversation, how to control your body language, which mimic, which gestures you should expose. If you practice with pre-rehearsed phrases and memorize entire speeches and so on, if you try to control your movements, because of course there are studies showing that you need to, if you want to be more charismatic, then you need to reduce the number of movements you make. And also other research shows that people trying to lie typically freeze their body movements. So people working in lie detection, they're looking not necessarily for signs of nervousness, like nervous body movements, but on the contrary, if people seem frozen, then that may be a sign that they are lying, because they are consciously trying to block any kind of movements, nervousness. So if, on the contrary, during your communication training, you practice by exploration, by experimenting with different types of expressing one and the same thing, if you are willing to make lots of mistakes during the training to get a feeling of the variety of possible reactions you could have in a conversation, then the chances are high that you develop actual self-confidence, because your self-confidence will be built upon very diverse experiences. You had the experience of playing with different options of how to react, how to come across, and you are not afraid of not sticking to one formula that you have rehearsed. So typically politicians then say, well, I don't want to answer that, I'm not rehearsed, or they need to take a break. Could you please make a cut until I find the pre-rehearsed answer? Maybe you find on YouTube still there was presidential, in the primaries, in the Republican primaries some years ago, Herman Cain, a former pizza pizza mogul in the US, and he made interviews. He gave interviews where he was a bit, he couldn't find the pre-rehearsed answer, and you saw him looking around. What's the right answer? So he was asked about Libya, and then was searching in his memory what he should say about Libya, and then you saw like it made click, and then he said some pre-rehearsed sentence. So if we would practice by experimentation and willingly make mistakes during training, then in actual situations you will be much more self-confident, because you know that even if I make a mistake, I have already trained during the training how I could correct it. So the focus in the first type of self-confidence is how not to make mistakes in the first place. And the second type of self-confidence, the focus is everybody makes mistakes. I will make mistakes while speaking in public, but I can learn how to quickly acknowledge those mistakes, say sorry, and correct and go into another direction without this affecting me. If, as a type A, I make a public mistake in speaking, for example, then I should blush, become utterly embarrassed, and there are people who walk off the stage at such a moment. But if I'm type 2 self-confidence, then I say, oh, once again, a mistake. And you make a joke, maybe you have different options how to go on. And you will come across as much more human, much more self-confident actually, and trustworthy. What do you think? Here in the show notes, you have 2 articles you could explore. And I wish you a very successful week. If you have questions, comments, please contact me, write them down. And I can also make a small masterclass about communication psychology in your team, your company, organization, even church. Bye-bye.